It was a sunny Sunday, the perfect weather for a family lunch, but for Cyrus, that day represented a turning point in his life. He watched Celine as she finished preparing the meal. Her calmness unsettled him. For weeks, Cyrus had been rehearsing his words, expecting the emotional reaction he thought was inevitable. Finally, they sat down at the table. He barely touched his food. The weight of his decision settled heavily in his chest. "Celine, we need to talk," he said, trying to hide the tension in his voice. She looked up, serene, and set her fork aside. "Go ahead, Cyrus. What's so important?" He took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on his plate. I think we can't go on like this. I want a divorce." He anticipated a moment of shock, perhaps tears, a plea for him to reconsider. But Celine remained silent for a few seconds. Then, with disarming calm, she replied, "That's fine." Cyrus blinked, confused. That was not the response he expected. "Fine?" he repeated, trying to understand her lack of reaction. Celine looked at him, her eyes as calm as a lake's surface. "I already knew." "Knew what?" "About you and Dahlia," she said, with the same serenity. "And honestly, I've already prepared myself for this." Cyrus felt a chill run down his spine. That answer was everything but what he anticipated. He thought about trying to explain himself, but Celine interrupted him. "I accept the divorce. But I want one condition." He nodded, relieved that he seemed closer to ending the conversation than he imagined. "What condition?" "You'll never contact me again. Never. Let's move on with our lives, separately, with no loose ends." The silence that followed was suffocating. Cyrus had never considered the final impact of his decisions, but Celine's indifference hit him like an invisible blow. She got up from the table, without tears, without anguish, just an air of quiet relief. "We're done here," she said calmly and left the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. After the conversation, Celine closed the bedroom door with a serenity she never thought possible. Her breathing was steady, her heart beating firmly. She sat in the armchair by the window, where she could see the garden. The distant sound of birds filled the air, almost as if the world hadn't changed at all. But inside her, everything had changed. She remained there, motionless, for an unmeasurable time, watching the trees sway. Cyrus's words still echoed in her mind. "I want a divorce." Words that, until recently, would have been a devastating blow. Yet here she was, calm, as if those words had been a release. Finally, the weight of years of distrust and disappointment had been lifted. She had known for months about Cyrus's affair with Dahlia, and during that time, she had prepared herself, not for an emotional battle, but for a peaceful farewell. As the afternoon fell, the phone rang. Celine recognized her friend Marigold's number. They had planned a coffee, but Celine knew Marigold would notice something different in her tone. "Celine, is everything okay?" Marigold asked, already picking up on the slight hesitation in Celine's hello. "Everything's fine," Celine replied, with a calmness that surprised even herself. "Better than I could have expected." Marigold hesitated for a second, perhaps trying to decipher what wasn't being said. "What happened?" Celine sighed, a sigh that carried no pain, only relief. "Cyrus asked for a divorce today, and I accepted." The line fell silent for a moment. Celine imagined Marigold's expression, probably shocked, with her eyebrows furrowed. When Marigold's voice finally returned, it was filled with caution. "How are you dealing with this?" I thought this would be devastating for you." Celine smiled slightly, even knowing her friend couldn't see her. "I already knew Marigold. For a while now. He's with someone else and honestly, I don't feel anything for him anymore. I'm at peace with it." Marigold, still incredulous, insisted. "But Celine, how can you be so calm? Aren't you angry, sad, anything?" "No," Celine said sincerely. "I spent so long worrying about this, suffering alone. When I finally accepted that this was the truth, peace came. There's no more room for resentment." Marigold seemed to be searching for the right words, but couldn't find them. Celine took advantage of the pause and continued. "You know, I thought the end of a marriage would be painful, but now I see it as a new beginning for me. Acceptance has set me free. On the other end of the line, Marigold finally seemed to understand, her voice softening. I'm proud of you, Celine. I don't know if I would have that strength. It's not strength, it's just accepting reality, Celine replied firmly, but without arrogance, and refusing to live in the midst of a storm that no longer needs to exist. As she hung up the phone, Celine felt lighter than ever. She knew the next few weeks would be bureaucratic, sorting out divorce details, dividing assets, explaining to the few people who still mattered. But emotionally, she was more prepared than ever. She was no longer the woman waiting for reconciliation, apologies, or changes that would never come. She was, finally, at peace. Cyrus walked through the city center with a confused feeling. He had achieved what he wanted: freedom. Without Celine in his life, he was now free to live his romance with Dahlia, without guilt, without secrets. But strangely, the feeling of triumph didn't come. On the contrary, an emptiness accompanied him. It was the second week since he and Celine had formalized the divorce. And contrary to what he expected, things weren't happening as easily as he had imagined. Dahlia seemed distant, less interested than before. The time they spent together was no longer like the early weeks of their romance, when everything felt exciting and new. Now, Cyrus noticed a lack of depth in the relationship that began to disturb him. On an ordinary afternoon, sitting in the cafe where he used to go with Dahlia, Cyrus stared at his phone, waiting for a message from her. But nothing. He reread their conversations, trying to find some explanation for her withdrawal, but everything seemed normal up to a point. Until the moment he separated from Celine. From then on, Dahlia started canceling plans, claiming last-minute commitments, always postponing their outings. Irritation began to grow within him. After all, he had risked everything to be with her. He had left a stable marriage, albeit one without passion, for something that now seemed to be crumbling before it even began. Maybe I just need to be more patient, he thought. Things will go back to normal. That night, Cyrus called Dahlia. Hey, how are you? He tried to sound casual, but there was a hint of anxiety in his voice. Dahlia sighed on the other end of the line. I'm fine, Cyrus. Just busy. Busy? You've never been this busy before. What's going on? The silence on the other end made Cyrus even more uncomfortable. He felt cold sweat in his palms, a dark premonition growing in his chest. Cyrus, I think we should slow down a bit. The impact of those words hit him like a punch. What? Slow down? I just left my wife for you. This doesn't make sense now. His voice rose, frustration growing with every word. I know, Dahlia interrupted. But things are different now. I don't know if I'm ready for this, for all of it. It's all been too fast. Cyrus felt the ground opening beneath his feet. He had destroyed his marriage believing he was building something new with Dahlia, but now what he heard was the beginning of an end he hadn't imagined. You're not ready? He repeated, incredulous. Dahlia, what did you expect? I did what you asked, what we both wanted. She sighed again, but this time with impatience. I never asked you for anything, Cyrus. The truth is, I don't know what I want. Maybe I just need space. Those last words were the last straw. Cyrus hung up the phone without waiting for an explanation. He sat there in his newly rented apartment, alone, staring at the emptiness around him. He had traded a stable life for a promise that now seemed hollow. And in the silence of the room, without Dahlia and without Celine, reality began to seep into his mind. For the first time in weeks, Cyrus thought of Celine, of how she accepted the divorce with a calm he hadn't understood at the time. He remembered her serene demeanor, the absence of drama, how she simply moved on without looking back. Now, he was starting to understand what she might have known all along. And that gnawed at him. With no other choice, Cyrus tried to move on with his new life, increasingly aware that, in fact, he was more lost than ever. Dahlia was slipping through his fingers, and what once seemed like a dream was turning into a silent nightmare. Alone in the room, Cyrus wondered how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Cyrus's phone rang in the middle of the night, a jarring sound echoing through the empty apartment. He woke from a restless sleep, still groggy, and grabbed his cell. It was a message from Leander, one of his most trusted employees. He hesitated before opening it, already feeling an undefined anxiety wash over him. "I need to talk to you. It's important," the message read. Cyrus felt his stomach knot. It wasn't normal for Leander to reach out after hours, especially in the middle of the night. A wave of thoughts flooded his mind, but he pushed them away, assuming it was some business-related issue. The next morning, when he arrived at the office, Leander was waiting for him, his face pale and visibly uncomfortable. Cyrus noticed his employee's nervousness and, without beating around the bush, went straight to the point. "What's going on?" Cyrus asked impatiently, sitting down behind his desk. "Why did you contact me so urgently?" Leander seemed to be struggling to find the right words, which only heightened Cyrus's tension. "It's about Dahlia," Leander began, avoiding direct eye contact. Cyrus felt his heart tighten, suspicion rising. In recent days, he had noticed Dahlia's distance, but he refused to believe it was anything serious. He took a deep breath, maintaining his composure, and gestured for Leander to continue. "I know this is going to be hard to hear, but she's cheating on you, Cyrus," Leander finally said, his voice low and filled with guilt. "And I'm the one responsible." For a moment, Cyrus's world seemed to stop. The silence that followed was suffocating. He stared at Leander, unable to comprehend. What he was hearing didn't make sense. Dahlia, the woman for whom he had destroyed his marriage, was involved with his employee? He expected problems, complications, but not this. "What do you mean?" Cyrus murmured, trying to process the confession. "You and Dahlia?" Leander, now visibly embarrassed, nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I never wanted this to happen, boss. I swear. But she started reaching out to me. I tried to distance myself, but—" Anger began to boil inside Cyrus. His hands clenched into fists, and he stood abruptly, knocking papers and objects off the desk. "How could you do this?" Cyrus shouted, unable to control the fury consuming him. "I trusted you. And Dahlia, she never said anything." The words came out in a jumble, his mind a chaos of thoughts. He wanted to confront Dahlia right then and there, to demand answers, explanations. Leander took a step back, clearly scared by Cyrus's violent reaction. "I know this doesn't mean anything now, but I'm sorry. It was a mistake. I should have stopped," Leander said, his voice trembling, but Cyrus wasn't listening. At that moment, all the decisions he had made in the past weeks felt foolish. He had traded a safe and stable life with Celine for a fantasy, for a relationship that, in the end, was nothing but a lie. Dahlia had betrayed him, and now he had nothing left, neither her, nor Celine, nor the life he once knew. "Get out of here," Cyrus said, his voice low and filled with an implied threat. "I never want to see you again. You're fired." Leander hesitated, but knew there was no room for discussion. He left the room without looking back, leaving Cyrus alone with his rage and pain. The anger gave way to a feeling of helplessness, an overwhelming sense of failure. He collapsed into the chair, the weight of his choices finally hitting him fully. For weeks, he had lied to himself, believing that the future with Dahlia would be better, that she was what his life had been missing. But in reality, he was only sinking deeper. Cyrus picked up the phone and, with trembling hands, called Dahlia. The phone rang several times before going to voicemail. He tried again, and again. Nothing. Then, in a desperate act, he went to Dahlia's apartment. When he got there, the scene he found only confirmed his worst fears. The door was slightly ajar, and from inside, he could clearly hear Dahlia's laughter along with Leander's. They were together, with no hint of remorse. Cyrus felt as if the ground was opening beneath his feet. He said nothing, didn't go in, didn't even knock on the door. He just stood there for a few seconds, listening to the betrayal unfolding before him, and then, with no other choice, turned and walked away. That night, for the first time, he realized what he had lost. It wasn't just Dahlia. It wasn't merely his wounded honor. It was Celine, the only person who truly knew him, who had been by his side when he didn't even know what he wanted. And he had let her slip away. The streets of San Francisco felt colder that night, despite the mild weather. Cyrus walked aimlessly, his head down, thoughts swirling like a hurricane. The scene in Dahlia's apartment still haunted him. He could hear her laughter, full of disdain, echoing in his mind as a cruel reminder of the failure that now defined his life. Dahlia had betrayed him. Leander, a mere employee, had taken his place. Everything Cyrus had risked, everything he had sacrificed, was now crumbling. He had left Celine, his safe life, for an illusion that now felt emptier than ever. His pride, his self-confidence, everything lay in ruins. He finally reached the small apartment he had rented after the divorce. The door felt heavy, as if every time he opened it, he was crossing a threshold into a pit of despair. Cyrus threw his keys on the table and sank into the sofa, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the thought that he had destroyed everything that mattered. Celine was far away now, untouchable, and he knew there was no turning back. The memory of her, so calm and serene during the divorce, troubled him deeply. When he had expected tears and pleas, she had simply looked at him, already aware of everything, already at peace with the end. At the time, Cyrus had interpreted that as indifference. Now he understood it was much more than that. It was strength. The strength he had never had. He rolled over on the sofa, searching his phone for an escape, any distraction that could relieve the growing pain. But social media was an endless repetition of happy faces and perfect lives, a cruel reminder of how alone he was. Dahlia had been his world, the reason he had left Celine. And now Dahlia was out of reach, not just physically but emotionally. In the days that followed the revelation of the betrayal, Cyrus tried to continue his routine, but everything felt meaningless. He went to work, but his focus was shattered. The company, which had once consumed so much of his energy and ambition, now felt like a soulless obligation. His employees, already aware of what had happened, treated him cautiously, as if he were a bomb about to explode. More and more, Cyrus found himself isolated. He avoided friends, ignored calls and messages. Deep down, he knew everyone was judging him. They all knew he had destroyed his marriage for a woman who was now brazenly cheating on him. And worst of all, he knew they were right. On a Friday night, drowning in a bottle of whiskey, Cyrus looked at his phone, Celine's name flashing on the screen in his recent calls. He had rehearsed many times what to say, but he never had the courage to dial the number. What could he say to her? That he was sorry? That he had been foolish to trade her for an empty fantasy? All of that was true, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. She'll never forgive me, he thought. Celine had always been balanced, intelligent, and he had betrayed her not just with another woman, but with his choices. She had asked for a single condition in the divorce, that he never contact her again. And Cyrus had agreed. Now, that condition felt like a sentence. She had accepted the end with a dignity he had never understood until that moment. Cyrus rose with difficulty, the alcohol dulling his senses. He walked to the window, watching the city lights. Outside, life went on, indifferent to his pain. People lived, loved, and moved forward, while he was trapped in a cycle of regret and despair. For the first time, he wondered if he had ever truly loved Dahlia, or if it had all been a desperate attempt to relive a youth he had already lost. With Celine, he had stability, a real partner. With Dahlia, he had only fleeting excitement. Now, without either, all that remained was emptiness. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. He answered without looking at the screen, expecting it to be a business call. Cyrus? The voice on the other end was soft, almost hesitant. He froze. It was Marigold, Celine's friend. Cyrus's heart raced. He hadn't expected to hear her voice, and he certainly didn't know why she was calling. Marigold? He tried to sound casual, but the surprise was evident in his tone. We need to talk. It's about Celine. The silence that followed was heavy, and Marigold's distress was palpable. Cyrus felt his heart stop for a moment. Something was wrong. Something far worse than he could imagine. Cyrus gripped the phone tightly, his heart pounding like a runaway drum. Marigold's voice carried an urgency he couldn't ignore. What happened to Celine? He asked, his voice wavering slightly. On the other end, Marigold hesitated for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. She is okay physically. But Celine is going through a tough time, Cyrus. I know you two have drifted apart, and she didn't want me to tell you anything, but I think you should know. Cyrus fell silent, processing the information. He knew Celine was strong, that she had faced the divorce with a serenity he hadn't understood at the time. But something in Marigold's tone made him uneasy. Something had changed. Please tell me what's going on, he pleaded, his voice firmer now. Marigold sighed. Celine is moving. She's leaving San Francisco. She sold the house and is planning to move to Seattle. She wants to start a new life there, away from everything that reminds her of the past. Cyrus felt the ground vanish beneath him. He didn't know how to react. Celine, the only person he truly loved, was leaving his life forever. The feeling of loss was overwhelming. It wasn't just Dahlia's betrayal that devastated him. It was the realization that Celine was moving on, without looking back. Why are you telling me this? He asked, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. Marigold hesitated again. Because I believe you deserve to know. And, somehow, I think you still love her. Celine won't reach out to you, Cyrus. But maybe you should do it before it's too late. The silence between them felt like it lasted an eternity. Cyrus wanted to ask more, wanted to understand the details, but something in his mind was already starting to move. He knew this could be his last chance to try to redeem himself, to correct the mistakes he had made. Where is she now? He asked, determination beginning to rise in his voice. Marigold gave him the address. It was Celine's last night in San Francisco. She was still at the house, saying goodbye to what remained of her old home. Cyrus's heart raced. He knew that if he wanted any hope of a future with Celine, this was the moment to act. He thanked Marigold and hung up, remaining still for a moment. The decision was clear, but the fear of facing Celine, of confronting all his failures, was crushing. Still, he knew he had to do it. Cyrus grabbed his car keys and drove to the old house where he had lived with Celine. As he drove, his mind raced through the moments they had shared, both good and bad. He remembered how she had always been there for him, in the worst times, when he doubted himself. And now, he had lost her over a thoughtless decision, over a passion that had evaporated as quickly as it had ignited. When he finally arrived, the house was almost empty. The lights inside were on, but the bare windows made the place feel desolate. Cyrus hesitated before getting out of the car, nerves consuming him. He didn't know what he would say, nor how Celine would react, but he knew he needed to try. He walked up to the door and, with his heart in his throat, rang the doorbell. The door opened slowly, and there stood Celine, calmer and more beautiful than he remembered. She didn't seem surprised to see him, as if she had been expecting this moment. Cyrus, she said, with her characteristic calm, but there was a tone of fatigue in her voice. What are you doing here? He stood still for a few seconds, unsure where to begin. The words he had rehearsed in his mind evaporated, leaving only the raw and painful truth. He started, his voice choking. I made the biggest mistake of my life, Celine. I let you go. I hurt you. And now, I realize you're the only thing that matters. I came because I can't let you leave my life without trying. Celine remained silent, looking at him with an expression that was hard to read. She didn't seem surprised, but she also didn't seem moved by his words. She simply waited for him to continue, her face devoid of visible emotion. I know you said I shouldn't contact you again, Cyrus continued, his voice trembling. But I need you to know that I regret everything. If I could go back in time, I would do everything differently. Celine's eyes glimmered slightly, but it wasn't emotion. It was exhaustion. She stepped back, allowing him to enter. Cyrus walked in, observing the nearly empty house. The walls were bare, the furniture covered with white sheets. Everything indicated that she had already left that life behind. You made your choices, Cyrus, Celine finally said, her voice calm but firm. And I accepted that. Not with resentment, but because I knew it was best for both of us. You took one path and I took another. Cyrus felt a pang of despair. I know, Celine. But I was wrong. I don't know what I was thinking. Dahlia, it was all an illusion. I only see that now after everything that happened. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking again. Do you think it's just a matter of regretting it and that's it? That I'll forgive you suddenly, and things will go back to the way they were? There was a tone of frustration in her voice, something Cyrus hadn't expected. Forgiveness, Cyrus, isn't something you simply ask for. It's something that needs to be earned, and you haven't done anything for that. Celine's words hung in the air like a sharp blow. Cyrus felt the weight of the truth she had just laid bare. All this time, he had imagined that regret would be enough to bring Celine back. But there, in front of her, reality was different. He couldn't simply return and undo the harm he had caused. Celine crossed her arms, her gaze steady and unwavering. She wasn't angry, nor did she seem resentful. There was a mature serenity in her stance, something that made Cyrus acutely aware of his own inadequacy. He knew he would have to fight for any chance of forgiveness, but that fight wouldn't be quick, and perhaps it might not even be possible. I don't expect things to go back to how they were, Celine, he said, trying to regain control of his voice. I know I was wrong. I know I caused a pain that may never go away. But I can't move forward without trying to fix this. Celine sighed, tilting her head as if evaluating Cyrus's words. Fix? She repeated with a hint of irony in her voice. Fix what, exactly, Cyrus? The broken trust? The empty promises? That's not how it works. You left me, traded me for an illusion, and now, when you realize that illusion wasn't what you expected, you come back here thinking you can simply apologize and move on. Each word was a dagger. Cyrus knew she was right. He had left Celine not just for another woman, but for a fantasy of life that now felt emptier than ever. He searched for a way to respond, but Celine continued, her voice firm and resolute. I accepted the divorce because I knew it was the end. I didn't wait for you, Cyrus. I didn't sit around hoping you would come back because, for me, what you did was definitive. I built my life away from what we were. There were no tears or desperation because, deep down, I knew you had already left long before you told me. Cyrus felt the weight of her words sinking into his chest. He wanted to argue, to find some point that could soften the harshness of what Celine was saying, but he knew she was right. He had departed long before verbalizing the divorce. But I've changed, Cyrus insisted, desperately trying to find a crack. I understand now what I lost. I understand the value of what we had, the value of you. Celine shook her head slowly, her expression softening a little but still firm. What you lost, Cyrus, was the chance to be honest with yourself. I don't want to be a second choice, someone you turn to when everything else fails. I deserve more than that. You never really saw me, never understood what I needed. And I'm not talking about grand gestures or promises. I'm talking about being present, about being true, something you never were. Her words reverberated within Cyrus. For the first time, he felt he was truly hearing Celine. Not the serene and calm woman he knew, but a person with desires, with expectations that he had never fully grasped. He wanted to respond, to promise that he would change, that he would do everything differently. But he knew, deep down, that promises wouldn't mean anything. What can I do, Celine? The question came out as a whisper, almost like a surrender. He was exhausted, emotionally shattered, unsure what was left to say or do. Celine took a deep breath, as if carefully considering her response. After a moment, her eyes met Cyrus's with an unexpected intensity. I'm not going to give you an easy answer, Cyrus. If you really want to change, you need to do it for yourself, not for me. It doesn't help to come back and ask for another chance without having truly confronted what brought you here. I'm not the solution to your problems. I'm not the one who will fix you. She paused, taking a step closer to him but maintaining her firm posture. If you ever manage to redeem yourself to yourself, who knows? Maybe we can talk again. But I won't open that door while you haven't done that internal work. Forgiveness, Cyrus, isn't something you earn. It's something you achieve through actions, not words. Cyrus felt the raw truth in those words. That was it. There was no easy path to winning Celine back, and perhaps he would never do so. The road she was laying out for him was long and hard, and he would have to walk it alone. Celine then took another step back, as if sealing the final decision. "Now, if you'll excuse me," she said, a gentle sadness in her voice. "I need to finish getting ready. I have a new life waiting for me, and this story between us, Cyrus, is already over." Without another word, Celine turned and began to ascend the stairs to the upper floor. Cyrus watched her disappear down the hallway, unable to say anything. He knew that this was the end, at least for now. There was a chance for redemption, but he would have to seek it on his own. There were no guarantees that, even if he changed, Celine would be there to welcome him back. And for the first time in a long time, he realized that her forgiveness was not something he could demand or expect. It was something that, perhaps, might never happen. Cyrus left the house with a heavy heart, knowing that the road ahead would be lonely and uncertain. Cyrus walked back to the car, the weight of Celine's words crushing him with each step. He had never felt so empty, so lost. Throughout the drive there, he believed that his apologies and acknowledgement of his mistakes would be enough to win Celine back. But now, facing the reality she had presented to him, he understood that there was much more at stake. Once inside the car, he sat still for a few minutes, his fingers trembling on the steering wheel. The silence around him was overwhelming, and he didn't know how to fill it. What Celine had said echoed in his mind. "You need to do this for yourself, not for me." Those words swirled in his thoughts, challenging the way he had always viewed life. For years, Cyrus had acted on impulse. When things became monotonous with Celine, he sought excitement with someone else. When his relationship with Dahlia began to crumble, he reached out to Celine again, hoping she would welcome him back with open arms. He always reacted to circumstances, never reflecting deeply on who he was and what he truly wanted. Now, with everything around him falling apart, he found himself forced to confront something he had been avoiding for a long time: himself. In the days that followed, Cyrus tried to return to his routine, but nothing seemed to fit. Work was merely an obligation, and he barely had the energy to manage the company. His apartment, once a symbol of his newfound freedom, now felt like a prison. The thought of trying to move on without Celine, without any clear purpose, left him apathetic. It was only on a quiet afternoon, while sitting in the emptiness of his apartment, that he finally began to understand what Celine meant. If he wanted to change, truly change, he needed to do it alone. He couldn't rely on others to fix his life, couldn't seek external validation to justify his choices. The change had to come from within. Slowly, Cyrus began to take action. He distanced himself from the emotional chaos he had created. He stopped trying to reconnect with Dahlia, who was already completely out of his life. Instead of trying to recover what he had lost, he focused on understanding how he had gotten there. He sought therapy, something he had never considered before. Sitting in a room with a stranger and exposing his fears and regrets felt strange at first, but gradually, he began to understand his self-destructive patterns. During the sessions, he talked about his childhood, his constant need to prove something, both to himself and to others. He spoke about how incomplete he felt, always seeking validation outside himself that never seemed to come. Through these conversations, Cyrus began to realize that the true issue wasn't just what he had done to Celine or Dahlia, but what he had been doing to himself for years. The process of self-evaluation was painful, harder than he had imagined. It felt like he was dismantling every part of his life, piece by piece, to understand where he had failed. There were moments when he thought about giving up, about simply accepting that his fate was sealed and that nothing would change. But somehow, a small spark of hope kept him moving. As he worked on himself, Celine continued living her life. He no longer tried to contact her. He respected the space she had requested. He knew that her forgiveness, if it ever came, could not be forced or rushed. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that the forgiveness he truly needed wasn't hers, but his own. 6 months passed since the last time he saw Celine. During that time, Cyrus made concrete changes in his life. He reorganized his company, began dedicating time to projects that genuinely interested him, and for the first time, he felt a real connection with his work. He stopped seeking momentary distractions and focused on creating a life he could respect. It was on a Sunday morning, while walking through the park, that his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, surprised to see Celine's name. For a moment he hesitated. What did she want after all this time? His heart raced, but he took a deep breath before answering. "Hello?" His voice came out calm, controlled. "Cyrus." Celine's voice was as serene as he remembered. "I just wanted to know how you're doing." There was a long silence. Cyrus didn't know exactly how to respond. He had waited so long for this moment, but now that it was happening, he didn't know what to say. "I'm good," he replied, honestly. "And you?" "Good too," she said, a slight softness in her voice. "Marigold told me you've made some changes. That you're working on yourself." "Yeah," he said, not trying to justify himself or impress her. "It hasn't been easy, but I'm trying." "I'm glad to hear that," Celine replied, her voice almost a whisper. "I'm not calling for anything specific. I just thought of you and wanted to know if you're finding your way." Cyrus smiled to himself, realizing that was the question he had been asking himself for months. "I'm still looking, but I think I'm on the right path." There was a gentle pause, and then Celine took a deep breath. "Who knows, maybe one day we can have coffee. No rush, no expectations. Just talk." Cyrus felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. He didn't know if this was the beginning of a new chance with Celine or just a way to close the chapter. But for the first time, he wasn't desperate for answers. He was willing to accept whatever the future brought, whatever path it might take. "I would love that," he replied sincerely. Celine smiled on the other end of the line, and that sound, though distant, was enough to bring Cyrus a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. If you liked this story, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share the video. And until the next story.